The headlight caught something wrong in the snow. Daniel had been running the northern transect for 6 hours, the standard circuit he drove twice weekly through the interior of Banks Island, logging wildlife signs for the Canadian Wildlife Service's annual population survey. It was February. The temperature was -31 before the wind chill. The storm had been building since noon and was now the kind of weather that turned the world into a single uniform white, a condition experienced by Arctic travelers called whiteout and everyone else called impossible. He should have turned back an hour ago. He knew this. He kept driving. The shape was off the trail by 40 meters, partially sheltered by a pressure ridge. Too symmetrical to be rock, too still to be anything that was still alive. Daniel stopped the snowmobile. Cut the engine. The wind took the silence and filled it immediately. He walked toward it. She had been there long enough that the distinction between bear and blizzard had nearly ceased to exist. The cold had done what cold did at this latitude when something stopped moving long enough, built up layer by layer, filling the spaces between fur, turning the outer coat to a rigid shell that caught the ambient light and gave it back as a faint, pale gleam. She was sitting upright, head bowed, both forelimbs locked forward across something pressed against her chest. The posture was unmistakably deliberate. She had chosen this position and maintained it through conditions that should have been incompatible with remaining upright at all. Daniel crouched in front of her. The wind pushed at his back. Her eyes were closed. The lashes were frozen together, sealed by ice that had accumulated and refrozen across multiple cycles. Her breathing, when he finally located it, was so shallow it was less a rhythm than an occasional interruption in the stillness. He pressed his hand against her flank and felt, beneath the rigid outer coat, a warmth that was barely there but was still there. He moved his hand carefully toward what she was holding. The cub was perhaps 6 weeks old. It was tucked so completely into the space between her forelimbs and her chest that it had been invisible from any angle except directly in front of her. Alive, he could see the small ribcage moving with a regularity that its mother had lost. She had been spending herself to keep it warm. That was the accounting that had brought her to this state, all available heat directed outward, nothing retained. Daniel straightened up and looked back at the snowmobile. 50 meters away in the dark, he thought about what he had, what he didn't have, and what the temperature was going to be in 3 hours. Then he went to get the cargo sled. What followed took 40 minutes and was not elegant. The cargo sled had a loading ramp and a battery winch rated for 400 kilograms of equipment, which was close enough to her weight that it would work if he was careful about angles and didn't rush. He was careful about angles. He rushed twice, caught himself, and started over. The cold made everything slower, the winch, his hands, his thinking. He worked in the specific focused state that came from a problem with a clear solution and a fixed deadline, which was the temperature continuing to drop. He got the ramp positioned. He attached the winch cable to the cargo harness he rigged around her chest. Not ideal. The kind of thing that would make a proper veterinarian wince, but functional for the distance required. He ran the winch. She came up the ramp in stages, the cable taking weight gradually, her position shifting from sitting to prone in a way that looked, in the harsh beam of the headlight, like a slow surrender to something she no longer had the resources to resist. He secured her to the sled with 4 straps. He checked them twice. The cub he carried in his arms, against his chest, beneath his outer layer. It was so light that the weight of it barely registered. He could feel its warmth against his sternum, and underneath that warmth the small, rapid movement of its breathing, which was more regular than its mother's and carried, in its regularity, something that felt like information he needed. He drove back to the station carefully, at half speed, watching the sled in his mirrors every 30 seconds. The winter observation post was a single-room structure built for function and nothing else. Insulated walls, an industrial propane heater, a work table, a sleeping platform, supplies for 60 days. Daniel had been living in it since October. It was the kind of space that revealed, over time, exactly how much a person needed and how little that turned out to be. He got the door open. He got the ramp against the threshold. The winch brought her over the lip and onto the floor, where she lay on her side across the heavy utility mat he'd pulled from the wall and spread in front of the heater. He turned the heater to maximum. He put the cub against her chest and covered them both with the thermal blankets from the emergency kit. 3 of them, layered, tucked in at the edges. He filled the largest pot he had with water and set it to heat. He checked his radio. The storm had killed the signal as thoroughly as he'd expected. He set the radio down and went back to work. For the next 2 hours, he did what he could, which was not what a veterinarian would have done, but was what was available. Warm water applied to her extremities through towels, changed when they cooled. The cub repositioned periodically to ensure it stayed against her warmth. He sat with her through the changes in her breathing, the long, flat stretches, and the intervals when it deepened slightly, which he learned to read as progress. He did not sleep. There was no point in setting an alarm for something he was going to be listening for regardless. Around 4 in the morning, the cub woke up. It announced this with a sound that was less a cry than a question high. Uncertain. The vocalization of an animal whose needs were simple and unmet. Daniel had goat's milk powder in his supplies, kept for contingencies that had always been theoretical until now. He mixed it warm and brought it to the cub in a shallow bowl. Then, when the bowl proved unmanageable, in a bottle improvised from a water container with a corner of cloth worked into the neck, the cub latched on with an urgency that suggested it had been waiting longer than 4 in the morning for this particular solution. Daniel was kneeling on the floor, the cub in his lap, the bottle held at the angle that seemed to work. When the blanket on the other side of the heater shifted, he went still. The shift was small, a repositioning, not a sudden movement. Then another. Then the specific sound of an animal orienting to an unfamiliar space, the deep intake of breath that preceded full assessment, the kind of breath that gathered all available information before the body committed to a response. He did not move. He lowered his eyes to the floor. He kept the bottle where it was. She raised her head. The ice was gone from her eyes. They were clear and dark and fully present in a way that her condition 6 hours ago had made seem unlikely. She was looking at him, taking him in with the unhurried attention of an animal that was conducting a complete assessment before making any decision. The room was small. There was nowhere for either of them to be, except exactly where they were. He heard her breathing change. She smelled the milk. She smelled the cub. She smelled the warmth coming from the heater, and, underneath all of it, something that was harder to name, the particular quality of an enclosed space that had been maintained at a temperature incompatible with outside survival, which was information her body understood before her conscious mind organized it into anything like thought. Her head lowered. Not to sleep, she kept her eyes on him, but the tension that had been building in her frame in the seconds after waking released by degrees, slowly, in the way of a decision being made rather than a threat being calculated. She watched him feed her cub. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes did not close. After a while, Daniel let out the breath he'd been holding. He did not move from the floor. Neither did she. 3 days. The storm kept them there, 3 days of wind that made the walls flex and a cold outside that made the inside, by contrast, feel like a different world entirely. The cub recovered faster than its mother. As young animals generally did, within 24 hours, it was mobile, curious, and conducting a systematic investigation of every surface in the room at a height of approximately 30 centimeters. It chewed on Daniel's bootlaces. It located the corner where he kept his field notebooks and redistributed several of them across the floor. It returned, at intervals, to sleep against its mother's side, and she would press her nose to it each time with an attention that looked, from across the small room, exactly like relief. She ate from his hand on the second day, carefully, taking the thawed fish one piece at a time, her lips drawn back to avoid contact with his fingers in a delicacy that surprised him. She drank water from the large bowl he set near her. She watched him with the continuous low-level attention she had not fully withdrawn since she woke, tracking his movements through the room without apparent alarm, maintaining an awareness that was not aggression but was not indifference either. She was reading him. He understood this. He moved slowly, announced himself before rounding corners, and kept his voice low when he spoke. He spoke more than usual, not for her benefit, but because the silence of 3 days with a polar bear and her cub was a silence that seemed to require some counterweight, and talking was what was available. He told her the storm was supposed to break on the 3rd day. He told her that people were going to come and take her somewhere that could do more for her than he could, and that this was the correct outcome, and that he wanted her to know in advance so it wasn't a surprise. He did not know whether this information reached her in any form she could use. He said it anyway. The helicopter came on the morning of the 4th day. The wildlife veterinary team from Inuvik had been in radio contact since the storm lifted 4 people. A transport crate, the equipment that field stations didn't carry. They landed in the flat ground 100 meters from the post and came to the door in the careful way of people who had been briefed on what was inside and were adjusting their expectations to match. What they found was Daniel on the floor with the field notebooks the cub had redistributed, attempting to put them back in order, and a polar bear across the room watching the door with the alert but non-aggressive attention she had maintained for 3 days. The senior vet, a woman named Calloway who had been doing this work for 20 years, stood in the doorway for a moment before saying anything. Has she moved toward you at any point? No. Toward the door, once. On the second morning, she stood at the window for about 10 minutes and then went back to the heater. Calloway looked at the bear. The bear looked at Calloway. She's going to need sedation for transport, Calloway said. That part isn't going to be pleasant. I know, Daniel said. Tell me what you need me to do. The sedation was fast and professional, and the bear accepted it with the resignation of an animal that had, perhaps, reached its limit of new experiences for one winter. The cub was transported separately in a carrier that it investigated with the same systematic interest it had applied to everything else. They were airlifted to the wildlife rehabilitation facility in Inuvik, where the mother would be treated for frostbite to her extremities and the muscle damage from 3 days of static posture in extreme cold, and where the cub would be assessed and, if all went well, returned to the ice with her when she was ready. Calloway sent him a report 3 weeks later. Both were doing well. Release was scheduled for the following month, weather and ice conditions permitting. Daniel read the report twice, filed it in the appropriate folder, and went back to the northern transect. He didn't think about it constantly. The work continued: the surveys, the data, the twice-weekly circuit through the island interior. February became March. The light returned. which was the thing about the Arctic that never stopped being significant, no matter how many seasons you had experienced it. The days lengthened, and the ice began its annual negotiation with the warming temperatures, and Daniel documented all of it with the precision that the work required. In early April, he found a fish on the porch. An Arctic char, large, freshly caught, laid in the center of the step with a placement that was not accidental. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time. There were no tracks in the immediate snow. The overnight wind had erased them. He looked out across the flat expanse of the island interior, the ice shelf visible in the distance, the horizon unbroken and white. He saw nothing. He brought the fish inside, and he ate it that night. And he did not mention it in his survey report because it was not the kind of data the survey was designed to collect. 3 weeks later, it happened again. This time, a smaller fish, char, again. The same species at the base of the steps, rather than on the porch itself. Daniel looked out at the ice shelf with his binoculars and held them there for a long time. There were two shapes at the edge of the shelf, near the open water. One large, one small. They were too far to identify with certainty. The large one was facing in his direction. After a while, they moved north and were gone. Daniel lowered the binoculars. He stood in the doorway of the post for a moment, the cold coming in around the frame, the afternoon light laying itself flat across the island in the way it did in April, long and pale and without shadows. He didn't know. He had no way of knowing. The data he had was two fish and a direction of gaze at a distance that precluded confirmation. He closed the door and went inside to write it down anyway. The island Daniel worked on, Banks Island, in Canada's Western Arctic, sits at the edge of what scientists now track as one of the fastest changing marine ecosystems on the planet. The numbers tell a story that is difficult to argue with. Minimum sea ice across Canadian Arctic waters has dropped by more than 40% since satellite monitoring began in the late 1970s. In the Western Arctic alone, the bioregion that includes Banks Island, the frozen portion of the ocean during summer months, has fallen from roughly half to less than a third over a single generation. The Arctic as a whole is losing approximately 77,000 square kilometers of sea ice every year. That is an area the size of South Dakota or the island of Newfoundland, gone annually, compounding. Polar bears need ice to hunt. Without a stable frozen platform, they cannot reach the seals that sustain them through the year. They come ashore earlier each spring and leave later each fall, fasting for longer each season, raising fewer cubs to independence. In the southern Hudson Bay subpopulation, one of the most closely monitored in Canada, the most recent aerial survey counted 618 bears, where 842 had been counted 5 years earlier. That is a 27% decline in 5 years, in one region, in a species that was already considered vulnerable. The October 2024 assessment from the IUCN Polar Bear Specialist Group confirms what the regional surveys suggest. Some high Arctic subpopulations are temporarily stable, benefiting from newly accessible water. Others are declining faster than they can adapt. The overall trajectory depends almost entirely on what happens to the ice, and the ice depends almost entirely on what happens to global emissions over the next 2 decades. The mother on Banks Island was one bear. She made it. Approximately 26,000 others are navigating a habitat that is shrinking beneath them, not by accident, not by predation, but by a process that is entirely within human capacity to slow. If this story stayed with you, the most direct thing available is support for the organizations doing the fieldwork. Polar Bears International funds the population surveys, the sea ice monitoring, and the behavioral research that produces the numbers in this video. Their website and donation link are in the description below, alongside the primary sources for everything cited here. And if you work in the Canadian North in wildlife monitoring, in conservation science, in any of the disciplines that document what is actually happening in the Arctic, the work matters. Daniel's survey data was one file in a database that spans decades. That database is what we know. And what we know is the only foundation we have for what we decide to do next.